cannot stress how important it is to discipline your feeding. Exactly the same as any kind of fishing in the winter time. You have to be really careful and mindful of your swim management. How much bait are you entering at one point? And to me, it's patience. You know, it's patience and what I'd class as a progressional feeding pattern as the day progresses, whether you're in a match or you're pleasure fishing. If you go at the middle of winter, and when the temperature starts dropping, the water clarity starts increasing, with the intention to put your box down, put a load of bait out and expect it to work. At some point it might work, but you're immediately pushing fish out of your peg by allowing too much bait to enter the water at a sudden time. And what happens is, especially during the winter months, although you might be on the bank fishing for 4, 5, 6 hours, you might only have 2 hours of a feeding window where all of a sudden, whether it's the light changes or the afternoon warms up, or the fish are just so used to feeding at certain times of the day that they do have that little feeding time. If you manage your peg correctly, at that point, that is where all of a sudden you start catching. However, if you don't manage your peg correctly, then all of a sudden, when you should be catching and other people are catching around you, you've almost as if you've put too much bait in your peg. The fish are feeding, but they're not attracted to your feeder because they've got too much choice. So choosing the right feeder in the winter is literally the difference between giving yourself the chance of catching a lot of fish or very little. So in my hand here, I've got 3 feeders that I mainly use for short work commercial fishing, whether it's summer or winter. So for example, at the moment and during the winter time, I want to take a step back and think about what bait I want to enter into the water. When the water starts going clear, I base a lot of my method feeder work, because that's what it is, whether it's a hybrid feeder or a flatbed feeder, it's a method feeder, around pure pellets. I want individual particles in my peg. I don't want a cloud, I don't want a haze, and therefore ground bait is off the menu when the water goes clear. And this is where your 2mm pellets, your 3mm pellets if you're allowed to use them, but generally fishery commercials, you're generally using a 2mm pellet. These are the 3 feeders I'd be using all through the year, but there's only one feeder in my hand for this kind of fishing that I'll ever use. But let me explain why. So for example, a flatbed feeder is really good with micros and ground bait. That ground bait helps really combine those micros around your feeder and retain a little tight parcel for a longer period of time. As soon as you cancel out ground bait with a flatbed feeder, your bait's getting released extremely quickly. And in the winter time, I think there's too much spread once that bait is getting released from a flatbed feeder and giving the fish too much choice. What I want to do in the winter is I want to create an aggravated feeding pattern. And what I mean by that is I'm loading the feeder up, my hook bait's escaping, but the majority of my bait is still within the feeder itself. And in a way, you're annoying the fish to take your hook bait quicker because they've got a minimal choice. It's not like they're going up to that feeder and sucking all bait out in the winter. They're a little bit cagey. They're coming up and feeding around the particles on the outer perimeter of your feeding zone or your trap, let's say, around the feeder. And that's exactly what you get with a hybrid. It allows you, the angler, to really manage how tight of that parcel you want, and that's simply by how you load the feeder. It's not just a case of putting bait in the feeder and chucking it out. There are so many ways how you can get your bait working within that feeder, and that's what I love about the hybrid feeder. It allows you to really manage how you want that bait to work. So when it comes to the winter time, for short range commercial work, fishing for small to medium sized match carp, where you might be casting on a regular basis eventually, but your first 2 or 3 hours will be patient fishing, that small hybrid feeder is absolutely perfect because I'm disciplining how much bait I'm putting in. If all of a sudden I start getting an arrival fish, well, that's good. But the last thing I want to be doing is thinking, right, I'll put a bigger feeder on now, because all I'm doing is I'm giving too much choice for the fish to feed on. So when it comes to the winter time, really have a think about how you want to discipline your feeding pattern and be patient with your casting. And what happens is, from 15-minute casts at the beginning of the session, because you've taken your time and you've been patient and confident with your swim management, not rushing things, by the end of the day, your casting time will have decreased by half at least, because you're now attracting more fish into your peg, but there's minimal choice, therefore you get a bite quicker. If you go the other route of putting a big feeder on, your choice is too much for the fish and they back away from your hook bait because there's too much choice, literally. And this is why it's not just a case of chucking this little feeder down one hole all the time. It's exactly like what you do in the winter time with a pole. If you're on a commercial, you've got to pick 2 or 3 lines to rotate. With that little feeder, it's like a pole match. You know, you're fishing a feeder against a far bank, one slightly down in the deep water away from the shelf, one on the inside line, one down the edge. You've got several lines to rotate against. And whilst ever you're just introducing a small bit of bait, i.e. with 1 cast or 2 casts in that area and then moving, by the time you drop back in the line that you've rested, you generally get a bite. And that is how it works in the winter time. So really be mindful of how much bait you feed and what size feeder you actually use. It will make a big difference on how many fish you actually catch throughout the whole of the winter months.